When trouble comes knocking at the door, spiritual amnesia just seems to set in, doesn't it? It doesn't matter how many scrapes God has pulled me out of. It doesn't matter how often things work out for the good. When I find myself in a crisis, I always manage to forget that God has got things under control. That forgetfulness is the bad news. The good news is I'm in good company. We all develop spiritual amnesia, and we hit the panic button when an unexpected crisis enters our lives, and that's just what the Israelites were doing in this morning's reading. Just 2 chapters earlier, we find Moses and the Israelites bursting into a song of thanksgiving after their miraculous crossing of the Red Sea. And although they found themselves in a hostile desert wilderness, God takes care of them by transforming the only available desert water from an undrinkable and bitter-tasting cesspool into thirst-quenching, sweet-tasting water. Shortly after that, they stumbled upon an oasis of 12 springs of water and 70 palms. And in the chapter just prior to this morning's reading, God miraculously provides meat in the form of quail and bread which literally falls from the sky. Clearly, God has their back. As treacherous as the desert is, God proves over and over that their needs will be met. And yet, when the water supply begins to once again run low, the crowd goes into panic mode. It's as if the crossing of the Red Sea, the oasis, the quail, the supply of bread, they never happened. Spiritual amnesia has set in for the Israelites. And the temptation, when we find ourselves in crisis and we're unable to recall God's faithfulness, is to fall into anger and resentment. Our text says that the people quarreled and complained against Moses, and that sort of attitude can become contagious if we allow it. Moses seemed to give in to their bitterness when our text says, he cried out to God, "What shall I do with this people?" The same thing happens to you and me. The home budget takes a hit when the unexpected car repair comes to more than we had anticipated. And what do? We take it out on our partner and family members who we feel are spending money frivolously. And before you know it, the whole household is either snapping at each other or sulking in silence. And on Sunday, we glare at the pastor when he has the audacity to make his regular appeal for the offering. And the pastor, well, he decides he's just fed up with all these penny pinchers. Quarreling and complaining are contagious if we allow them to be so. Not only that, but we can spend so much of our energy complaining that we never get around to analyzing the challenge and addressing it. We simply get stuck in our problem and stuck in our state of mind. And that's the danger. The Israelites had become stuck. They were unwilling to go any further, and yet God's response to Moses was to go ahead of the people, to keep moving forward. And if Moses obeyed, Moses would find the solution. In this case, an unlikely rock that would yield forth water. Gerald Jansen points out that sustaining water comes not from where they are, but from where they are headed for. And so a question for us might be, what would it look like to be sustained by the future more than by what is right before us in the present? As long as we are stuck in our attitude of quarreling and complaining, as long as we buy into the lie that God is unable or unwilling to lift us above the problems of life, then we forfeit our power as God's own beloved children. And when we do that, we will constantly be asking the same questions that the Israelites asked. Is God with us or not? What I find interesting are the names that were given to the place where this desert miracle happened. The names weren't Hebrew versions of saved again or God's providence. Instead, the names given to the place where their thirst was quenched by the water that gushed forth from a rock was Massah and Meribah, which mean test and arguing. They would forever remember that time in their history as a time of testing and arguing rather than as a time of salvation in the desert. But you know what? I'm guilty of the same thing. I tend to remember the 6 days I was out with the flu instead of how good it felt when I began to get my strength back. I remember the challenging and difficult people that I am so grateful are no longer a part of my life, instead of appreciating the good people who continue to enrich it. I remember my spiritual deserts instead of giving thanks for the oases. And if there's a challenge in this morning's text, I think it is to recall the oasis points in our past, where provision of our needs has carried with it a strong sense of God's presence on the one hand, and on the other hand, to not become so stuck in our attitude of despair that we are unable to look to a future hope that draws us forward. In other words, the cure for my tunnel vision of despair is to remember the oases of my past and to keep moving toward the hope for future. If I can do that, if I can continue to recall and give thanks for the many blessings in my life, and if I can also continue to believe that God has plans for my welfare and not for harm, for a future with hope, if I can hold on to these two things ever before me, then I will be able to answer an emphatic yes to the question, is God with me or not? God is indeed with us, always has been and always will be. But even when it feels as if God isn't, even when it feels as if God has abandoned us, then when there seems to be no evidence, even when there seems to be no evidence of God's presence in our circumstances, we need to resist the temptation to give in to complaint as an ongoing state of mind. Remember that God is compassionate. God didn't allow the Israelites to die of thirst. Their needs were met. There was water in the wilderness, even though it wasn't apparent. God remains compassionate to you and me. There is water in our wildernesses, even though it may not look like it. It's easier said than done, this business of moving past the dry spots in our wilderness. When we're stuck in a place without water, it's hard to remember the oasis points in our past. And it's just as hard to believe that God's plans for our future are more than just wishful thinking. But with support from each other, we can recall God's care for us in our past, and we can come to believe in God's plans for our future. And if we can do this, we will know that indeed God is with us and always will be. Amen.